Ladies and gentlemen, this episode was, I gotta say, fantastic. It exceeded any expectation I could have possibly imagined. Chris and I sat down with him, and the hours leading up to the interview, I was messaging Chris. I was like, dude, I'm so freaking nervous. Like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I was actually giving myself a pep talk as if I'm about to go out on stage in front of thousands of people. It was just such an experience, right? It's the first time I had ever interviewed or talked to, much less a famous person, and it was such an honor that he would even accept the invitation to be on, and graciously accepted to come back too at the end of the interview. So this was one of these things that I will never forget, and I'm sure Chris could share that sentiment as well. It was such an honor. I can't stress that enough. We talked about a lot of things. We got personal. We talked about fun things, his career, an overall good dude. Marc Guggenheim is good people, folks. You listen to this podcast, then go follow Marc on Twitter. Check out all of his stuff. Check out all of his stuff on CW. Now, Arrow's off the air, but watch it anyway. Go buy the DVDs. Like, support anything this man has put his name on, my friends. I'm telling you, he's a good dude. This was such a fun conversation, and hope you guys enjoy it. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we are talking to Marc Guggenheim. Marc, how are you today?
I think all things being equal, I'm pretty good. Got my health, my family's healthy. It's obviously some really crazy times, but I truly do not have anything to complain about.
It's always good to hear. I'm fortunate right now. I've never lost a day of work. Now, before this whole global pandemic, a lot of people looked at my type of work which is retail, convenience store. They looked at it as kind of lesser, and I'm thinking, well, I'm essential. So what are you doing? But
Right.
no, to be serious, I'm just very glad that I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I can continue to work and provide for myself.
Absolutely. I think those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to continue to work or have our health, I think it's really sort of prompted all of us to think, okay, you know what, I'm going to value a little bit more and appreciate a little bit more what I have. Whereas I think some of us we're not doing that prior to the pandemic, and that's something I think you'll forgive the expression. That's something any crisis, sort of forces you to do is some introspection, some taking of inventory.
Right. And I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about, as I mentioned on Twitter, depression and anxiety. That's
Yeah,
really the basis of what I started this podcast for. My father had passed away, and I really didn't know what to do, and didn't really feel comfortable going to a therapist. And so I thought, let me just like say these words out loud, if only to myself, and see how I feel. And I've
mhm.
been doing that since January, and here we are in June, and I'm still doing it. And of course, it's turned it more into sort of like a pop culture discussion forum. But that's the thing. It's if you could focus yourself on positive things that you enjoy, then maybe you're not thinking so much about the negativity. But
Yeah.
what have been your experiences with depression, anxiety, any sort of issues like that?
How much time do you have?
Um,
I have quite a bit. I come from a long line of people who suffer from anxiety. You know, very severe anxiety to the point where, I call it the family curse. It's just this genetically ingrained thing. I've been on medication for depression and anxiety for, I do math here. It's a goodly long time, something close to 17 years now. To digress for just a little bit, about 3 years ago, this is like right after, this is a bad time, right after we finished Crisis on Earth X, and around the time the whole Andrew Kreisberg thing was happening, I made the very questionable decision to go off my medication. And that kicked off basically among the 6 months of my life that are among the worst. like the discovery that, oh my God, I really need this medication. And then of course, it takes time to go off of it. It takes time to go back on it. And for like 6 months, I was someone I didn't recognize. And it wasn't even just, quite frankly, it wasn't even just the anxiety that did come absolutely roaring back, or the depression that also came roaring back, but also just a personality shift. Like I found myself getting angry at the smallest little things, and it was really truly horrific. And I'm really grateful to everyone who was working with me at the time, and my wife and my kids who were incredibly patient with me, because I just for a good chunk of those 6 months I was not anyone I recognized. So I have quite a bit of experience. I've been in therapy for about over 20 years. I started the medication after my grandmother passed away from cancer, a long bout with lung cancer. And it is a daily struggle. It's this, it's sort of, I know oftentimes we sort of put anxiety and depression into the same sort of category. Like we say, it's anxiety and depression, like Batman and Robin. But the truth is, while they are related, they are, at least in my case, they're different things. They're different animals. And the way I manage the two is different. And so, I don't know, long story short, yeah, I have a great deal of experience with it. Cannot tell you honestly that I have either one kicked. And certainly, the pandemic and just the state of the world right now has definitely given me my depression a run for its money.
Yeah,
Do you find that your writing helps with you with that?
I'm a funny kind of writer. I'm one of there's two types of writers, really. I think there's the writers who hate writing and the writers who love writing. I become a real dick if I'm not writing. I need to be writing almost every day, or I just become very, very difficult to live with. I'm one of those few writers who really does love the practice of writing. The way I like to express it is, I'm not, I don't consider myself a particularly smart guy. The guy who types, the writer guy, he's much smarter than me, and he's much more creative and clever than me, and he thinks of things that I would never think of. And I basically write to spend as much time with that dude as I can.
Yeah, I've never suffered from severe anxiety or anything, but doing this interview is a way for me to kind of push through a little bit, because I've always had a certain level of social anxiety where new situations, new people, I've missed out on jobs because I couldn't get through the interview very well and things like that. And I was on medication for about a year. And so I had lost my job and lost the insurance that came with it. And so I couldn't get back on medication, and I've kind of learned to manage it without. And it is rough, because I saw myself transition from just outrage over the littlest things to noticing that go away, and then watching it as it returns, and then finding little ways to kind of manage through that. One of those being this podcast, or binge watching shows like Arrow or Legends. And I've found that those things have helped, and it's kept me kind of relaxed and in a fun mood, I guess you could say.
That's really terrific to hear. I'm a big believer when it comes to anxiety and depression. There's no magic bullet. There's no one size fits all remedy. Hearing your story, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, that's really sweet that Arrow and Legends have helped you through this. At the same time, I'm kind of outraged on your behalf that, like, you lose your job and therefore you lose access to medication, and you have to sort of self-medicate basically. And that's a real, that's a huge problem to me in our country. And I think there's no medication that is actually, like, there's a lot of work that I have to do even while I'm on medication. but to take away medication is, that's really horrible. And that's not a circumstance I think that anyone, in this country should have to live with. But unfortunately, far too many do.
Right. I mean, it's hard once you're actually given the opportunity and then you lose it. It's going back on it. It's the difficult part.
Oh, yeah. Believe me, I remember going back on it is really, really, really bad. It's the whole thing, going off of it, going back on it. It's like I said, like I wouldn't say the worst 6 months of my life, but definitely, a contender for the title.
For sure. And it's given me a lot of regrets, and little things, but I mean, still, it's things you look back on and think, man, I wish I would never have said that thing to that person, or,
Oh yeah.
and then those people leave your life and you can't get those moments back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's 1,000% it. And it's funny, like no one really sort of tells you about that. Like no one tells you that that's an aspect of it. And it's really like, it's like I said, for 6 months I was someone I didn't recognize, and that's a scary place to be. It's a very scary thing to like be acting out of character and knowing that this is not who you are. And I think there's a difficult realization that comes, very humbling realization that comes with realizing, oh, wait a second, I'm really dependent on this, this chemical addition to my body. It's tough stuff. I mean, it really, really is. But I think, I don't know, my hope is, look, not to get political, but since this is actually how we got to meet each other on Twitter, and anyone who follows me on Twitter knows I have no problems with getting political, particularly now in this time and space. Look, I think, Biden's got to become president, and we have to introduce a public option so that everybody who wants healthcare in this country can get it. I mean, that's got to be that's got to be a right. And your story is the perfect example of why it needs to be, because the idea that like you could lose your job and then lose access to the medication that you need to, to just be yourself, much less like the medication that a lot of people need to avoid suicide, to avoid mental, and cognitive impairment, all sorts of, reasons. It's just basic. I think it's just basic human decency. That says, look, we're gonna take care of everyone in the country.
And it's especially hard when a lot of people don't really understand the severity of something like a depression or anxiety. They think, oh, well, you're just mad, get over it. And I was like, no, you don't understand it. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a bigger issue than you could possibly understand unless you've actually gone through it or have known someone who's gone through that.
1,000%. It's a very, very, even if you've known someone, it's a hard thing to articulate to other people.
That's kind of where I am. I don't deal with anxiety or depression, or if I have, it's been very short periods of time where I deal with it and it's over and it's in the past. But both my wife and my oldest daughter deal with those things, and it's hard when you're on the sidelines watching them go through it, and there is literally nothing that you can do to make it better other than just hold them tight and say, I love you, I'm not going anywhere, right?
Yeah.
It's hard also just being the person that's there to be the supporter. So
absolutely. No, it is tough all the way around. These are horrible, I mean, really horrible diseases. And that's what they are. They're diseases, and you wouldn't, I mean, if you God forbid you got COVID-19, you wouldn't not get treatment for it. And yet there's so many people who suffer from anxiety and or depression who go completely untreated and who are self-medicating. Sometimes they're self-medicating with drugs or alcohol or both. And, I mean, you look at the opioid crisis in America, you gotta look at that very serious problem and recognize that that's because you have a lot of undiagnosed or untreated, I should say, people suffering with anxiety and depression, and they're just self-medicating, and they're probably suffering from, depression because, they've lost their jobs, or, they're having to work 3 jobs to, put food on the table, provide for their families, and you name it. We got to do better. We just have to do better.
I will say that I've been really happy with the fact that, there used to be a very, very big stigma about coming out as dealing with anxiety and depression. It was just a secret that people dealt with privately. And I feel like more and more people are talking openly, like you are now, about their struggles with anxiety and depression. And I do feel like the more that people uh, share that that you can still be a successful person and yet struggle with those things. I think the more we get that message out, I think the better the world's going to be.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think I'm older than you guys, and I grew up, where there was a lot of stigma around, seeing a therapist, much less going on medication, God forbid. And I agree with you. I think that there has been a very much needed cultural shift there. And like most things thrive in the sunlight. And, if you can, be transparent, and if you can talk about these things publicly, I think it's ultimately to the societal
good. For sure. I mean, people, I think the biggest thing is the people that come out and say like, oh, you're just acting out, or you don't just don't think about it. Don't let it bother you. I don't think they're trying to be hurtful in any way. I just think not enough people are coming out and saying, look, this is what this is. A lot of people are afraid to do that.
You know what? I have to say, like, lately, and I know I'm going to make a very reductive point, and the danger with reductive points is that you take a complex problem and you oversimplify it. But I really, feel like the root cause of a lot of the things that are plaguing us is a lack of empathy. And what you're talking about, when someone says, well, just get over it or tough it out or something, that's a lack of empathy on display. That's basically someone saying, I don't, I lack the empathy that allows me to think about someone else's experience, and the idea that in someone else's experience, it's not as simple as just get over it or suck it up. And I think, again, I don't think it's the magic bullet, but I think if everyone had a bit more empathy, or at least any empathy, the world would be a better place. And you'd certainly see less examples like the one you're talking about.
I guess we're kind of going to shift gears, I guess, a little bit, because really we want to get down to about kind of like what you've done, where you've been as far as your career and what you're doing. And I'm going to let Chris here take over for just a bit and kind of like go through like what you've done, what projects you've worked in the past, or what your favorite ones were, what you're doing now. And so I'm going to give it to him and let him kind of go through all that.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So I guess for me, I just wanted to pick your brain about, being a writer. Did you always want to be a writer? Like when you were young, was that something that you had really set your mind on when you were little, or was that something that you didn't discover you had a passion for until later?
More the latter, I would say. I think I was sort of always interested in storytelling, but it never occurred to me that there was a career path for me for it. I did some short stories in high school. I was the editor-in-chief of the school literary magazine, but it was never anything I truly considered as a career path. I actually wanted to be a lawyer, and that's what I ended up going to school for, and that's what I ended up doing. But for me, it was my third year of law school, which is kind of like your senior year of high school.
Right.
My brother Eric, I'm the oldest of three, and he's the middle child. And my brother Eric was in his senior year of film school at NYU, and he asked if I would co-write a script with him. He wanted to learn more about script writing. And we wrote a couple scripts together, and I found I really got bit by the bug, and I found I really, really enjoyed it. One thing I'd always enjoyed was putting words together. I really did like writing research papers, in high school and college. I liked the music of language. That's always appealed to me. But it wasn't until I started script writing with Eric that I realized, oh, I also like telling stories. So it was sort of the realization that those two things could go together in my mind, made me just want to continue doing it. So I graduated law school and I started practicing, but in all my free time, I would write. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to write for like an hour to 2 hours each day before going into the office. And, as my writing refined itself, I started getting meetings out in California. So I would take my vacation time away from the firm and always spend my vacations out in Los Angeles and take meetings, and sort of started building up, kind of a reputation and a fan base around town. But it was not a foregone conclusion that I was going to be a writer.
Well, that's cool. My daughter wants to get involved in film school. That's really her dream. She wants to be a film editor.
Oh,
And any tips that you would give for people that want to get involved in either screenwriting or into film and any industry? What would you recommend?
well, I'll tell you, I'm a very big believer in reading and writing, but also consuming and doing. Depending on if you're going into writing or if you're going into something, like directing or editing. I think by consuming a lot of TV shows and movies, if you're a writer, certainly reading a lot of scripts, I think that's, the best education you can have. I think you learn as much from the great movies and TV shows as you do from the really horrific ones. For those people going to film school, the one thing I would caution is that, both my brothers went to film school, one for directing, the other for writing. And the one pitfall I've sort of noticed is that teaching someone an art, and that's what, anything in entertainment is, it's an art form, as much as a craft. You can sort of fall into the bad habit of feeling like there are rules as opposed to guidelines. So what I'd say to your daughter is go to film school, soak it up like a sponge, but just remember that what you would be doing as an editor is an art form, and in an art form, there are no rules. Even the guidelines are made to be broken. So that's my general advice about, the subject of film school. But I think, consuming and doing is really the best education. And I admit I'm giving very self-centered advice because, that's the way I broke in. That's the way I developed my craft. I went to law school. I didn't go to film school.
No, I totally get that. I got into writing poetry in college, and for me, I started by copying what other people were doing. So I would write poetry like Shakespeare, or I'd write poetry like T.S. Eliot, and I spent a long time trying to sound like other people. And it took me a very long time before I threw all that out and just started writing like myself. And I guess that's kind of the pitfall that you get caught up in trying to follow all the rules, and you don't just allow yourself to be creative. So that is good advice.
Yeah, thank you.
I noticed that you had written for both Marvel and for DC Comics.
Yeah.
How important or influential is that for you in kind of developing what you'd eventually do with the Arrowverse?
I think it was, I think, when you're a writer, everything's grist for the mill. And every project I've ever worked on in any medium has always helped provide another brick in that wall of education. So, at the same time, it's kind of hard for me to articulate it. But I will sort of say this: in writing Marvel comics and writing DC comics, the two universes, they don't handle the same. I tend to think of each universe as like sports cars. But a Ferrari handles differently than a Lamborghini.
Right.
And I would say that in many ways, Arrow was our execution of Arrow, I should say, our interpretation of Green Arrow for television was a bit more Marvel-esque than DC. And I hope that's not a controversial statement, but
No, yeah, I'd like you to explain it a little bit, because it's interesting. What does that exactly mean?
Well, I think the Marvel universe, and here I want to be clear, I'm referring to the comics. Because obviously there's the DC Cinematic Universe and there's the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But in terms
Right.
of the comics, Marvel has always sort of been the world outside your window. It's always had a bit more grounding to it, a bit more sort of man on the street kind of sensibility. There's no Gotham or Metropolis. There's Los Angeles and New York City. And and I will say, there's also, as a result of that, there's a slightly darker tone. Whereas the DC Comics has a more hopeful, sunny disposition. And I think, this difference, this dichotomy that I'm talking about is actually best represented by the amazingly incredible, seminal, never to be repeated again crossover that Kurt Busiek and George Perez did, JLA and Avengers. And by sort of taking the heroes from one universe to the other and vice versa, they really highlighted just, how the Marvel universe is different from the DC universe. So I think that sort of grounded world outside your window sensibility was really driving a lot of the choices we made with Arrow.
So I do want to ask, what are some of like the favorite projects you've done over the years?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll tell you, first of all, like, it's always the last thing I did is the favorite. The youngest child is the cutest. And probably if you ask me this question tomorrow or next week, you'd get different answers. I would say Eli Stone was the first show I co-created, first time I show ran. That show is, had a lot of hope and inspiration and just a message that I think, we could really use right now. My daughter was watching, my 12-year-old daughter was watching in quarantine, so I had a chance to revisit it recently, and I'm like, oh, this was a really good show. What else? I love, my time writing Spider-Man, was absolutely a career highlight. Certainly Arrow, that's had such a huge part of my life. Troll Hunters, that, has been a part of my life for as long as Arrow has, actually. I started working on Troll Hunters during the first season of Arrow. But every project, I have to say, like, has its, things about it I remember fondly. Sometimes it's just a small moment, or the fact we were able to do something I never thought we'd be able to do, or down to a clever line of dialogue. At the same time, there's not a single project of mine that I wouldn't like another at bat on. Everything I've ever worked on, I've got regrets about, and I think that that's true for every writer. So it's a weird thing. It's fine. I tend not to think about my own work. Like, usually I do something, it comes out or it doesn't, and I move on. I'm on to the next project, and I don't spend a lot of time kind of looking backwards. And then there's also, there's the project, and then there's the experience. And sometimes they're equal. Like, sometimes, it's a great project and it was a great experience, but like, there was a year when we were developing Eli Stone, and we were casting it sort of in a very long pre-production. I spent a year as a consulting producer on Brothers and Sisters. And then, this is not to take anything away from the show. I actually love the show, but I just had the best experience. Like, it was so much fun. It was just like where everything sort of came together, and the show was a hit, and everything was just magical, and it was like, I look back on that year of working on Eli and working on Brothers and Sisters, I'm like, oh, that was like one of my favorite years of my career.
That's cool. I think that for me personally, as I look over the stuff that you've done, I grew up during the 90s, during a time when, I'd read comic books and I would dream about what those comic books would look like when they finally were in a movie or when they were put into a TV show. And at the time, the CGI just wasn't there to make it quality. They had tried a couple times in the past and they just hadn't been very good. But I remember the dream that someday I'd be able to see my favorite characters on TV, and certainly we had seen that before with a couple of those shows. But for me, Arrow was one of those programs that I think first really got my attention. Can you kind of explain a little bit about how you went about creating Arrow, and if you had realized that it would kind of create this universe that we've been enjoying?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you, I can't talk about Arrow without first talking about Green Lantern, because so much of the Green Lantern experience informs Arrow. I'll give you a little backstory. So Greg Berlanti and I were working on Eli Stone, and even though it's funny, we hadn't even started filming the pilot yet, we felt like the network was not behind us. It felt like we were swimming upstream. It felt like they didn't quite respect or appreciate the project. And we were in New York, and we were casting for Eli for the pilot. And we were flying back, and on the flight back, Greg said to me, like, I have an idea for a movie take based on Green Lantern. And we just spent the whole flight back talking about it. And we, then Michael Green, who both of us had worked with on Jack and Bobby, and Greg worked with on Everwood, came into the fold, and the three of us spent, like 6 months to a year writing a draft of Green Lantern. And then, Greg was attached to direct, and we were, we did several drafts, and then, they basically, I think what happened was Warner Brothers realized, wait a minute, are we really going to let three TV writers do a $250 million movie?
Right.
And that's when Greg was replaced by Martin Campbell, and Michael Goldenberg was brought in to rewrite the script. And, long story short, the project kind of got taken away from us. And the movie that you saw is the, what resulted. And the lesson there was, first of all, not that we needed to be taught this particular lesson, but adapting these Silver Age characters for the 21st century is really hard. Marvel has a little bit easier. Their characters are from the 1960s. There's not a domino mask in sight. They don't have a character who makes big green fists and whose weakness is yellow. And that's to take nothing away from what Kevin Feige, who's an absolute modern genius, has done in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But it's just the degree of difficulty is a little higher. At any rate, recognizing that degree of difficulty, we went into Arrow with a lot of trepidation. There was, a good period of time where we didn't even want to do it, because we were just afraid that history was going to repeat itself, that we would, do this work and then eventually it would get taken away from us. Now, in television, it works a little differently than features, but we were fundamentally afraid of the notes process. We were afraid of the project becoming something different, much the same way Green Lantern had, just by simply being noted to death. So our first goal really was, we said, look, we can't develop this the traditional way, in the traditional network way, which is typically you pitch to the studio, then you pitch to the network, then you write a story area, then you write an outline, then you write a script, then you rewrite the script 20 million times, get notes, all in the hopes of getting a green light for your pilot. And it's a process that just, has a lot of notes and in a lot of cases can take you away from what the essence of what the project wants to be. And what Greg and I said is we're not going to do it that way. We will pitch to the studio, we'll pitch to the network, and then if you guys like what we pitched you, you'll get a script. There won't be a story area. There won't be, an article in Variety. There won't be an outline. It will just be us in a room working on a draft that no one knows we're working on. And then we will give it to you, and you will decide whether or not you want to make the pilot. And that's, by the way, that's, not to take anything away from the executives we were working with, who are all very fine people and really are friends of the show and everything. But we really felt like the way to pull this off required us to have a lot more autonomy than is typical. And then, we turned in our first draft, and David Nutter, who directed the pilot, and David Nutter, just, you can IMDb him, but basically he's the Steven Spielberg of pilots.
Okay.
He's the best pilot director in the history of television. And his record for getting pilots picked up. He did Smallville. He did Supernatural. He directed the Red Wedding episode of Game of Thrones.
Oh wow.
I always said, like, I've never met anyone so suited to their job as David is to directing pilots. It's like he was grown in the lab for that purpose. And he was a big part of the reason the pilot was what it was, and it was just a process of us just having a vision and always sticking to it, and always fighting for it, and putting every decision, the big ones and the small ones, through the lens of that vision. At the same time, like, to answer the second part of your question, did we think it was going to spawn anything? From my perspective, the answer is no. From my perspective, the exercise was, how do we not embarrass ourselves? How do we avoid a repeat of the Green Lantern experience? That being said, I think halfway through Arrow season 1, Greg started to feel like, well, maybe we can do a Flash spinoff. But I think even then, I don't think he was envisioning, what we ultimately ended up doing. I mean, I remember when we did Crisis on Earth X and we had the big scene on the bridge of the Wave Rider with all the characters, I sent a picture of it to Greg and going like, did you ever think this was ever going to happen? I don't think any of us had, the ambition or the foresight to go, you're going to have this many characters, all in one place at one particular time. I mean, it continues to blow me away that we did that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just amazes me how that it all started with Arrow, and from that, we get the introduction of White Canary, of the Atom, of Legends. To me, it's just amazing how influential that one show has been to the entire fandom. That's pretty amazing.
Thank you for saying that. I have to say, I hadn't really thought of it that way. And I like action. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a fair point. But it just goes to show you how little introspection I do in general, much less with respect to the shows.
So I don't know if you're able to tell us anything about what kind of projects you're working on currently, or if that's all just hush-hush, but...
there's some stuff I can talk to you about. It's weird. My workload is a little bit like an iceberg where, there's a certain amount that's public that's over the waterline, and then there's a whole lot of stuff that's not public and I'm not allowed to talk about. But publicly, the 3 things that are on my plate are Jackpot for Sony Pictures, based on a character I co-created back when I was writing Spider-Man. Then there's Gantz, also for Sony Pictures, based on a very cool manga and anime. It's been a manga, an anime, a CG film, 2 live-action films. It's a really, really great, exciting property that actually Guillermo del Toro had turned me on to. And then there's Prophet, which is based on the Rob Liefeld Image comic, of the same name, and he debuted in the 2nd issue of Rob's Youngblood series. And in addition to that, I think the other thing I can talk about is um, coming very soon. I don't think I can announce the date. Will be Wizards, which is the third and final of the Tales of Arcadia series that we do for DreamWorks and Netflix that I do with Guillermo. And then nothing's public yet, but I've been actually doing a lot of comic book writing. One of my New Year's resolutions, the only one I really kept to, was to do more creator-owned comics. I'd sort of dabbled in that space off and on over the years, and I thought this would be a really good time, sort of post-Arrow, post-Crisis, to just start generating my own IP. And I've really been having a blast doing that. None of the projects are in a state where we're ready to announce them yet, but it's a lot of fun. And there's, it sort of is, writing them has been a reminder to me that as much as I love Marvel and DC characters, I have an equal love just for the medium of comics. And I love telling stories in that medium. That's just incredibly gratifying to me. So that's been a lot of fun. And then there's some other stuff that I can't quite talk about.
Steven has been talking to some people on Twitter about some questions that they had, and I'm going to let him go ahead and ask you those if you're ready for them.
I'm ready.
All right.
All right. So there's one thing. It's not really a question, and of course I saw it on YouTube. I'm going to throw his name out, and I want to say for the record, before I say this, I'm not trying to attack this person. He goes by Pagey on YouTube. Stephen Amell actually has watched a lot of his videos because one interview, Stephen actually brings up Pagey. So in some of those videos, he's noted with the Green Arrow and Canaries spinoff that, and in his opinion, was that he felt like maybe it got a little too much attention and it took too much away from Arrow season 8. But I guess to sum that up, do you know where that's going? Has there been any progress with that as of now?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, it's funny. I don't know if I accept Pagey's premise that Canaries took over too much of season 8. I know that there have been people who were like, if you only have 10 episodes, why are you spending 1/10 of your season on a backdoor pilot? The answer to that question is, if we didn't do the backdoor pilot, we'd only have 9 episodes. That objection is premised on the assumption that we always had 10. The truth is, we actually always had 9. And we added the 10th episode, once the network and the studio asked us for a backdoor pilot. And that's sort of, by the way, not to digress too much, but like, this is something I do see a lot on Twitter, like people making a lot of assumptions that tend to be incorrect about just the way television is produced. And I don't personally feel like the narrative of season 8 was hijacked by Mia and her cohorts at all. But everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that's totally fine. As far as what's going to happen, I don't know. And even if I did know, I wouldn't be in a position to announce it. I am expecting an answer very soon, within the next couple of weeks. But, one thing that's clear is the pandemic has thrown a lot of things into, uncertainty. But I'm optimistic. I think, in one interview I had said I wanted to, if we didn't get picked up, I wanted to sort of continue the story in comic books. And I think a lot of people read far too much into that, quite frankly. I always sort of look at things one step at a time. The first step is we have to find out, what the powers that be want to do with respect to Green Arrow and the Canaries. And if they decide not to pick it up, well, then we'll have to, discuss a variety of different solutions, or a variety of different ways to keep those characters alive. But I think I tend to look at these things as really quality problems, in the sense that I love the fact that we have characters who people really want to see. in some way, shape, or form. We have actors who really want to play those characters, who are very interested in returning to play them, even if the spinoff doesn't get picked up. These are all wonderful quality problems, and truth be told, the quality problems is what I think has led to a lot of the cooler things we've done in the Arrowverse. It's sometimes these things have sort of forced us to come up with creative solutions, and sometimes we do it as a different kind of spin-off. Sometimes we do it as a crossover. Sometimes we do it as an animated. Sometimes we do it as a comic book. And one of the things one of the earliest decisions we made was that everything that was a tie-in to the live-action shows would be considered canon. So that's allowed us, I think, to do the animated shows that actually, quote unquote, mean something, or stories that actually, quote unquote, happened. And same thing with the comic books. I love comic books. I love the fact that we can, stretch into them. But yeah, I wish I had an answer. Believe me, I'm as desperate for it as you guys. Beth Schwartz and I text about it, pretty much almost every day. Kat McNamara and I were just texting about it. But this is showbiz. You gotta, sometimes you gotta wait. There's a lot of projects, that I have kind of on the 10-yard line where I'm just waiting to hear back. That's the nature of this.
Awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to go down the list of these questions. I just wanted to throw that out there. So Nolan asks, who came up with the constructs from the Green Lantern movie, like the race car, the different things that they would use? Was that something that was in your original writings, or was that part of the rewrite process?
Well, we certainly had constructs in our draft. And I always like to point out that a very simple Google search, Green Lantern, screenplay PDF will surface our first draft. It's our first draft, so I don't necessarily think it's our best draft, but it definitely gives you a sense of what we had planned. With respect to the race car in particular, that was not ours. That was Michael Goldenberg and Martin Campbell. We had something different that I, quite frankly, preferred. This is the race car is obviously, that's the first time Hal becomes Green Lantern, as a superhero, uses his powers. And in our draft, what happened was, like in the comics, Hal's dad died test flying a plane. And in our draft, the flight wasn't a test flight, it was an air show. It was the Ferris Air annual air show. In our draft, Carol is in the plane, and there's a malfunction. And so basically it's kind of like life repeating itself, history repeating itself. Hal is watching, rewatching basically the death of his father. And that's why he, activates the ring and suits up as Green Lantern and sort of publicly outs himself as Green Lantern. So very, very different from the Hot Wheels car. But I couldn't, I was never privy to why Martin and Michael made the changes that they did. We did 5 drafts. The last 2 we did for budgetary purposes because our first drafts were crazy expensive. They altered what they felt they needed to alter.
All right. I'm going to have to check out that first draft script. I did not know that, actually. I enjoyed the movie. I mean, I definitely felt like it could have been way better. So Michael Siegel would like to know, did Earth 66 survive the reboot? And also, what Earth would the Gotham series and the Dark Knight trilogy be set in? And he wants to add, thank you for everything you've done for the fans.
Oh, well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it very much. No, my general sort of rule is all the Earths that got destroyed were reconstituted when the multiverse got reconstituted. And the reason for that is that I didn't feel like it was our place to destroy the universes of that created by other people. Similarly, I don't feel like it's my place to dictate an Earth designation for things like we'll call it the Nolanverse. I will say that with a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, our naming convention was based upon the year the property came out. So it would have been, Gotham came out. Gotham came out during the second season of Arrow, which was, I don't know, I got to count. That's math, but you can IMDb that. Same thing for when Batman Begins came out. The only time we didn't do that is when there was like an overlap, or if we had some cheeky, Easter eggy kind of thing. But generally speaking, the Earth designations were based on the years of premiere.
Awesome. Ken Reed would like to know why was Oliver written so much like Bruce Wayne instead of the funny and more comedic Oliver from comic books and from Smallville?
Great question. Well, for one thing, and by the way, I get a lot of questions / criticism for this. It wasn't, by the way, it wasn't so much that we were trying to make him like Bruce Wayne. Actually, kind of, to be honest with you, kind of the opposite. The thing about Bruce is he comes back from his training, and this is comics, this is Batman Begins, this is, every iteration. He comes back and he's kind of laser focused. He goes through his, formative period where he's learning to be Batman. He comes back and he's kind of the best version of himself. We wanted actually our Oliver to be suffering from PTSD. We wanted you to go, wait, what happened during those preceding 5 years? How badly did that screw him up? So, I mean, there's a Bruce Wayne aspect, in the sense that they're both orphans, they're both wealthy, in the comics, he had an arrow cave, an arrow jet, an arrowmobile. As far as why not wisecracking and stuff, it would have been antithetical to our, hyper grounded approach. We were going for dark. We were going for, mysterious and moody and, it's funny. The Green Arrow that I know, that I sort of fell in love with was the Green Arrow of Longbow Hunters, the Mike Grell Green Arrow, who, when I read it as a teenager, he never struck me as being particularly lighthearted or funny. But I know that version of Green Arrow exists and is beloved by a certain segment of fans. I won't say it's a large segment of fans, because if that were true, Green Arrow would be as popular as Wolverine in sales. But certainly there's a small but very vocal segment of the Green Arrow fandom that, misses the goatee and the Robin Hood hat and the liberal politics. And look, hey, like I said, you guys know, anyone who follows me on Twitter knows I'm as far left as it gets. But that character wouldn't have been consistent with the, sort of really dark, post-traumatic stress version of Oliver Queen that we were going for.
Yeah, and I definitely think that a boxing glove arrow probably wouldn't have served him too well in the series.
Well, but there was a boxing glove arrow when they had that introduction of Wildcat.
Yep.
So you were still paying homage to that.
Well, I think, that was Keto Shimizu, who came up with that. I love her for it. I love her for many reasons. But when I saw that in her draft, I was so happy. And it's here's the thing, like, there are Silver Age conceits that you can do in the modern day, and you can even do consistent with sort of a darker, more grounded take. It took us 3 years to kind of, get there, to come up with that idea. Also, I think, if we had done that in the second episode of the first season, I think it would have sent the wrong tonal message about what we were going for. But by the time we did it in the beginning of, towards the beginning of season 3, I felt like, we had earned it from a tonal perspective.
Right. I actually completely forgot about that until Chris brought it back up. I mean, holy crap. I totally slipped my mind. So Donnie McGinnis wants to know, are there any plans for Titans or any other DC TV show to cross over into the Arrowverse? And how could you top Crisis?
There are no plans. I had a, there are no plans. How do we top Crisis? I don't know if we can, at least in the short term. You know, I would never say how do we top anything, because I felt that way after Invasion. I felt that way after Crisis on Earth X. I never doubt our ability to top ourselves, but I think what made Crisis, what it was the culmination of 9 years of world building. And I'm not saying, you have to wait another 9 years before we do something like, say, Infinite Crisis. I'm not saying that's what we would do. Just giving an example. But I think to go straight from, Crisis on Infinite Earths to something on the scale of it would only be a letdown for people.
Right. And
I
I think
to actually answer the question more succinctly, the way you top Crisis, I think, is by doing it at the right time in the right way. And if you're not prepared to do it at the right time in the right way, then you're not going to be able to top Crisis.
I agree with that. I think it's too much too soon. It's just too overwhelming. Dakota Hawk would like to know, if you had a choice, what would be the next hero that you would add as a standalone series?
Ooh, good question. I'm thinking.
It's a difficult question to really pinpoint one character.
It is. It is tough. Oof. Dakota, I'm gonna completely punt on your question and just say I'm gonna answer the question in the worst way possible. I'm gonna rewrite it and say, pretend that you asked me what I wish we could do. One of the things I really, really wanted to do, and I pitched it and it never really gained any traction, was I wanted to, with Arrow going down, I wanted to take the Arrow sound stages and the crew and the department heads and basically call, it would form what I call a production hub. And we would basically use all that talent and all those amazing people to do like a mini series about Sarah and Nissa, or a Constantine movie, or you name it, sort of really let's bring in new people, but rather, play with the existing toys, and sort of, create like an anthology. So an Arrowverse anthology remains one of the things that I would really love to see. I will say, never in my wildest imaginings did I ever think we were going to end up, seeing on the CW the characters we ended up seeing. I mean, when we introduced, Slade Wilson in season 1 of Arrow, that was like about at least a year ahead of our original plan. Same thing with Roy Harper, at least a year ahead of our original plan. We ended up adding all these characters so much faster than we ever discussed with the studio network, or really ever discussed amongst ourselves. We always said, oh, okay, if we get to a season 3, we'll do this. If we get to a season 5, we'll do this. We ended up doing, all the we'll do this stuff, we ended up doing in the first 2 years.
Oh, wow. So Alex Stewart would like to know if iZombie is part of the same multiverse universe, and again, what designated Earth number, which you've already answered sort of that question.
That's honestly, I would love to think so. That, truth be told, is really up to Rob Thomas and the powers that be at DC Comics, quite frankly. Above my pay grade. One of the things I have to say, look, show running Crisis was definitely a career highlight for me and a lot of fun. But I'm always very cognizant of the fact that, I don't work for DC Comics. I'm not a high-level executive at Warner Brothers. there are certain things that I don't feel, equipped to answer. For fear of making decisions for other people. Like, I would never want to make that decision for Rob, for example.
Right. That's understandable. And the next question, Chris, I believe it's your brother, Corey.
Yeah.
He wanted to know what pop culture references we may be able to expect from the next season of Legends.
Ooh, good question. Honestly, just too early to answer. There's been, everyone's sort of working away, on the season. I've read story areas for the first 3 episodes, but who knows how anything is going to get impacted by how we have to produce things post-pandemic or during the pandemic.
Right.
So I'm very, very loath to say, oh, next season on Legends, you're going to see this, because this may change. And I don't, a lot of it, I feel like, every time I do interviews and podcasts and stuff, a lot of it I feel like is managing expectations. I never want to get people's hopes up for a certain thing. I can tell you that there's something in the works that's Legends related that is very, very, very cool and very fun pop culturally, and is actually happening, but it hasn't been announced yet. So everyone will just have to sort of go like, okay, what the hell is he talking about now?
That's exciting and very intriguing. So we'll wait and see, I guess, on that one. So Robert would like to know, when they hired Katie Lotz to be Sarah Lance, how far out was her storyline planned?
Okay, well, this is Robert Emmerich, I believe, who is my
yes,
a friend of mine from college, her husband. Hi, Robert. So here's sort of the backstory about really Sarah Lance. So in the pilot, obviously, Sarah Lance was played by an actress who's not Katie Lotz, and seemingly died. And one of the first conversations we actually ended up having, let me go back a little bit. The normal part of a pilot process is you write the pilot, you go into pre-production on the pilot, you go into production on the pilot, and then you go into post-production on the pilot. And during those 3 stages, you kind of can't help but start having conversations about what the post-pilot episodes would be, or even what the post-first season episodes would be. And one of the first things that we discussed was the idea that Sarah Lance did not, in fact, die aboard the Gambit. When we knew we were going to tell that story at the, in season 2, at the beginning of season 2, we discussed, recasting. I'm a horrible person. I forget the name of the actress. She was unavailable because she was doing a show for E, I believe. And E is a now defunct cable channel. So we knew we would have to recast, and we went through our normal casting process. David Rappaport and Lindsay Baldessari are incredible casting directors who cast all the shows. They brought us many wonderful actors, but Katie was the standout. And actually, Stephen was kind enough to fly down from Vancouver on one of his days off to do a chemistry read with Katie.
Wow.
And it was great. It was just, we just knew. We just knew it was a perfect bit of casting. In terms of like our plans for her, it kind of came in sort of fits and starts. We knew that, the whole reason to bring in Sarah Lance was really to tell the story about, Slade Wilson and Leanne Yu, and, that folded into the League of Assassins, which set up season 3. I can tell you that when we brought in Katie, it's not like we knew that we were going to do Legends at that stage. That came later. But when we killed her off at the start of season 3, we always knew that the Lazarus Pit was, was not only available to us, but would make a lot of sense, given her connection to both Nyssa and the League of Assassins.
Awesome. And I guess one more question. Jennifer would like to know if Green Arrow and the Canaries do go to full series, will they continue the journey of JJ, William, Connor, and Zoe?
You mean will all those characters be in the show?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We love those characters and we love those actors. There's always there's always the question of sort of actor availability, but one of the things that we've gotten, I think, very lucky with over the years is, even when actors haven't been available to do a full season, we're always able to make things work out where, they can, they come in, or come in and out and recur and stuff. And we kind of pride ourselves on being as inventive as we can to sort of work around everyone's schedules. And look, Lord knows, again, post-pandemic, who knows what those schedules will look like. The thing I was, Beth Schwartz and I were sort of just talking in general about, how our jobs are going to change, in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. And, the thing we were sort of saying to each other is that this is just going to require writers to just be more creative, to think outside the box and, try different things and, come up with cool stories that hopefully are invisible. The part that's invisible to the audience is the pandemic restrictions. I think that's the best thing that we can do. And a lot of times, like I said, we come up with things that are solutions for scheduling and logistical and production problems and budgetary limitations that the audience doesn't know about. And if we're doing our jobs right, they never know.
I guess I just, on my own question, and we briefly mentioned this on Twitter, that the talks of Michael Keaton returning as Batman for the 2022 Flash film. Your thoughts on that, and do you think that Crisis had anything to do with the inspiration to pull those characters in, with Ezra Miller being on, on Crisis? Do you think that maybe Grant Gustin pops in on the Flash movie?
Well, I got to be careful here because I don't want to talk above my head. I'll say first, as a fan, I'm just giddy. Like, I'm beyond thrilled about Michael Keaton reprising his role as Batman. Anywhere.
Yes, me too.
It's just, it's one of those things that, like, I never thought I would live to see the day. So this is very exciting to me, and thank God. The second part of your question that could potentially get me in trouble, I think what I would say is when we did Crisis, it ended up sort of prompting conversations about the multiverse. And I think when we had Ezra Miller on Crisis, you saw that, like, Jim Lee had announced or tweeted or both about how, DC was really leaning into the multiverse and embracing that aspect of its legacy. And I could not personally be more thrilled. I've long felt that, it's funny, like, everyone talks about, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and there have been a lot of people, not just DC, like there's a lot of people who have tried to replicate Marvel's success. And my attitude is, the concept of the multiverse has always been a DC concept far more than a Marvel concept. And, while Marvel may have a cinematic universe, I love the fact that DC has a multiverse. And that's just as a fan. I just think it's cool. So the fact that, the powers that be at DC are leaning into that for the Flash movie is, it's music to my ears. Again, just as a fan. because that's, you know, that to me is one of the things that differentiates Marvel from DC. You know, we were talking about like what's the difference between the DC universe and the Marvel universe. The multiverse is, you know, one of them.
Yeah, I always have loved the DC's take on the multiverse. Not to take away from the Marvel films, but their explanation of time travel and changing historical events and different timelines. While, and Chris and I discussed this on another episode, but I do much prefer like the if you change the past changes, but it's just really a matter of opinion, honestly. Not one is better than the other, but I love DC's take on the whole multiverse concept.
Well, you know, again, going back to the, you know, the Marvel versus DC distinction, I think, you know, God, I mean, I could talk for days about how genius Kevin Feige is, but one of his genius, one of the elements about his genius is the Marvel Cinematic Universe feels like the Marvel universe. You know, that slightly more grounded, that science based, you know, feel. You know, down to their version of time travel. Um, it just feels like the tone of the Marvel comics of yore. And I think that's, you know, again, I approach all these things as a fan first, and as a fan, I just, you know, I'm in awe of what he's done.
That's a good perspective to take on that. I never really considered the fact that it does go in with the tone of the actual overall comics.
I had one more question to ask. I know we've asked you a lot of them at this point, but I felt like if this was a question that kind of popped into my head as we were talking. I had one more question to ask. I know we've asked you a lot of them at this point, but I felt like if this was a question that kind of popped into my head as we were talking. You have said that you are about as far left as you can go, and first of all, I respect that and I appreciate it. And so I wonder how important it is for you that viewpoint shows up in the scripts that you write, making characters that are inclusive.
You know, that's a great question. Well, it's funny. Like I started to formulate my answer, and then you said inclusive at the end. So I'll speak about two different things, and then you'll tell me how close I've gotten to answering your question.
Okay, sure.
For me, the perspective, a progressive perspective, is not what I want to see on television. What I want to see on television is more like the TV that I grew up with. Back when I was, you know, growing up in the dark ages, television reflected and debated and discussed the issues of the day. You know, LA Law would do an episode about flag burning, and you would get both perspectives. The problem is that just even addressing a political issue on television became known as a progressive perspective, which is kind of perverse when you think about it. But as a result, we've ended up with television that just does whatever it possibly can to avoid any discussion of anything that could be considered controversial or political or just a debate in the public discourse. And I think both our society and our just entertainment are worse off for it. As far as inclusivity, I gotta say, if inclusivity is a progressive issue, then we're all in a lot of trouble. Inclusivity is a human issue. It's a creative issue. It's not a political issue. Inclusivity, it just makes TV better. You know, and I'm talking about inclusivity. I'm talking about in front of the camera and behind the camera. If that's considered a progressive view, then we're all in even more trouble than we're already in, and that's really saying something.
Well, so I ask is because there are people out there who would argue that you shouldn't have gay and lesbian you know, characters on shows, and I've always thought that that so many of these shows that you've written and participated in, they've taken a very clear, strong stance, um, and so I've appreciated that. Um,
It's funny, speaking like the people who say like you shouldn't have gay or lesbian characters on your shows. I would go, why not? I mean, last time I checked, there are a lot of gay and lesbian people,
yeah,
and they watch television too. You know, honestly, like those people. Let's just be totally frank about it. The people who have a problem with that are people who have a problem with gay and lesbian people, and I don't I don't make television for bigots. You know, it's really, I think it's, you know, quite frankly, it's really that simple. And like I said, if having diverse representation of races and orientations and gender identities is considered progressive or liberal, you know, I think we're all in a lot of trouble. Truth be told, I think those people who do say it's progressive and liberal, what they're quite frankly trying to do is hide their own prejudice. They're dressing up their bigotry in political language, and that's sort of the thing. I think, you know, I'm going to go on my soapbox here. We've allowed this country, the discourse in this country, to descend to the point where simple morality is now a political issue. Morality is not political. There's no both sidesism to morality. There's no both sidesism to being anti-racist. There's no both sidesism to being a good person and having empathy and caring about your fellow human beings. And there's no both sidesism to prejudice. You know, so look, if we were, you know, if television was like, hey, we're going to do an episode on abortion that's all about why you should get an abortion, I'd go, yeah, that's really pushing a very, you know, crazy agenda. And truth be told, let's be clear, I don't think progressives feel like everyone should get an abortion. What progressives feel is people should have control over their own bodies and their bodies shouldn't be legislated. Anyway, long story short, I think, you know, the people who have problems with, you know, diversity on television and in film, I think they should search their own consciences and ask themselves why they have such a problem. I'll do half the work for them and tell them it's not politics. That's only something you're saying to make yourself feel better.
well, I really do just appreciate it a lot. I've watched other shows that appear very whitewashed,
Yeah.
and to me, I just really appreciate the intentional stance that your shows have taken to make sure that you got characters like, you know, John Diggle and you know, and characters who are, you know, bisexual or characters who are just strong female you know, characters who frankly don't need a man to take care of them, as the father of, you know, two awesome daughters who are you know, gay and bisexual, having a show that that highlights people that are just like them, I'm thankful for.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate that. That means a lot. You know, I have to say, I do think one of the reasons why the shows are as diverse as they are, part of it's, you know, there's a lot of diversity behind the cameras, particularly in the writers' rooms. You know, and so that's driving some of this. But the other thing is, we all recognize that when you're doing a superhero show, I think you have a special responsibility to show diversity. And that's because you want to send, and again, I don't view this as a progressive message. I just view this as a moral message. You want to send the message out there that not just straight white guys can be heroes. You know, and I don't even necessarily mean superheroes, but heroes, whether they have capes or not, need to reflect society. If you're only, if the only superheroes running around are straight white guys, as quite frankly they've been for a very, very long time, then I think just the world becomes a little less. The world is worse off for it. And again, those people who complain about this, I'm like, you've got decades of straight white men in comics. Like, what are you so afraid of? Those comics aren't going away. Those comics are still being published. So, like, pick up a comic book and read it if you want. Get yourself a subscription to DC Universe, or get yourself a subscription to Marvel Unlimited, or go on Comixology, and you can spend the rest of your life reading reading about straight white guys in tights. They're not going anywhere.
This has been a lot of fun, Mark, talking to you about all sorts of things.
I got to tell you, it's been fun for me too, guys. And I really do have to tell you, and I hope you won't edit this out. You would never know that you guys are quote unquote new to the podcast game.
Thank you.
I mean, you guys, like, they're great questions. You keep things moving. You guys are very articulate. I never would have known that you guys have only been doing this for since January.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of inspiration just from listening. I listen to a ton of podcasts.
I do too, actually. I love podcasts. Back in the days when I could actually drive, that would be what I would listen to while sitting in Los Angeles traffic. This has been a great deal of fun for me, guys. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We've been looking forward to this conversation for just a really, really long time. And we were freaking out a little bit about, what do they say about the warning about not meeting your people you look up to, right? But you made this a great experience, and thank you just for sharing with us, where you come from and your thought process and what you really clearly are passionate about.
Well, thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. I love, I love interviews where, yes, we cover all the geeky stuff because I love that stuff, but then we can talk about, real important issues like depression and anxiety and, representation in television. I think that's really great. It's nice to have your cake and eat it too,
For sure. I would love to have you come back sometime if you're able and willing.
Yeah.
Talk more about other things,
It would be my pleasure. It would be my pleasure. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on.
No, my pleasure. Let me know when it comes out, and I'll tweet it out.
All right.
And
awesome.
stay safe.
All right,
you too.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Take care, guys.